Hello, and welcome to today's webinar presented by RIMS, the Risk and Insurance Management Society. This session is titled Defeat Blind Spots and Cognitive Biases During COVID-19 and Pandemics with your host, Dr. Gleb Saporsky. I am Justin Smallson from RIMS. A few notes before we begin. If you have a question for the presenter during today's session, please submit them by writing in the question box. Feel free to ask at any point in the presentation, and we will reserve time at the end of the presentation for a Q&A. You will also see following this session, a recording will be available on Opus Ed. This presentation will offer neuroscience-based strategies to realistically evaluate the current COVID-19 pandemic realistically. It will also help to develop a long-term strategic plan to successfully navigate the disruptions caused by this and other pandemics. Our speaker, as I said, is Dr. Gleb Saporsky. He is the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts. His mission is to protect leaders from dangerous judgment errors known as cognitive biases, which devastate bottom lines and bring down high-flying careers. His expertise comes from more than 20 years of consulting, coaching, speaking, and training for mid-sized and large businesses and nonprofits. He previously spent years as a researcher, teacher, and behavioral economist and cognitive neuroscientist studying the psychology of decision-making in business and other contexts. Now I'll hand the presentation over to Dr. Saporsky. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Justin. I appreciate it. And welcome, everyone. Let's talk about COVID-19 coronavirus adaptation and pandemic, specifically for risk management professionals. So that's the goal. Let's talk about it. So the first thing I want you to be thinking about is how business leaders, very prominent business leaders, responded to the pandemic very poorly. Now, very prominent entrepreneur, one of the most, perhaps one of the most prominent entrepreneurs in the United States, and Elon Musk did not respond very well. Let's take a look at a March 6th tweet where he said the coronavirus pandemic is dumb, and again, I'm using him because he's so followed, so popular, that had 1.7 million likes. Now, how many people do you think underestimated the pandemic because they were following Elon Musk and his tweets? Same thing, I mean, this was on March 6th. This next tweet was on March 19th, so quite a bit after the March 16th declaration that this is a major national emergency, where Donald Trump came out and said that Elon Musk said that based on current trends on March 19th, probably close to 0 new cases in the US by the end of April. Well, we are approaching the end of April and it's only going up. So it's unfortunate, but Elon Musk is definitely wrong. But it's not only Elon Musk, it's also really prominent financial experts who analyze the situation and whose bottom line very much depends on them being good analysts. Goldman Sachs. They estimated the US GDP growth in the second quarter on February 24th after the coronavirus hit, so they decreased the previous estimates to 2.7 growth. So they thought it was going to be higher, then they said, well, coronavirus is going to happen, we're only going to have growth of 2.7%. That's what they said on February 24th, as Italy was undergoing serious case of the pandemic. Then on March 15th, around the declaration of the national emergency in the US, they said it's going to be a 5% decline. So 5% decline, 2.7 growth to 5% decline, that's a huge, huge jump. But that wasn't the worst. 5 days afterward, 5 days after they said it's going to be 5% decline, they came out with another note saying it's going to be a 24% decline. And since then, they decreased it to 32%. So we can see that even the most prominent financial analysts whose bottom line is very much dependent, their ability to attract clients and is dependent on giving clients good advice, they give clients very bad advice. So this happens very much as a result of following either entrepreneurs like Elon Musk or advisors, financial advisors like Goldman Sachs, and this is broadly representative of the vast majority of business leaders and business experts and analysts, thought leaders, the kind of advice they were giving. Most business leaders, the vast majority, were unprepared. They underestimated the threat of the pandemic, caught unprepared, and they turned to their emergency business continuity plans, as that's what they had available, right? The emergency business continuity plans. Unfortunately, those were not the best for this situation. And I say this as someone who frequently works with businesses on preparing business continuity plans. That's something I frequently do. I know that's something a lot of the people who are in the audience for this webinar are also doing a lot. but they're not a good fit for the situation. And why they're not a good fit? Well, they're great for emergencies. They're wonderful for a situation where, let's say, Houston is flooded, right? That's a great example for where a business continuity plan is wonderful, and it's really important to have that. But COVID-19 is not an emergency. It's not a good fit for that. It's a major disruptor, high impact, slow moving, long term. It's not the kind of emergency where Houston is flooded. It's more like the kind of emergency where Houston was suddenly flooded. This is the flood water is going up very slowly and eventually getting up to the level where Houston was flooded and then staying flooded for the next several years. This is not what business continuity plans are meant for. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And relying on business continuity plans leads to serious problems. You don't want to be doing that. And why? Well, let's talk about the facts about COVID-19. What's going on? First of all, it's highly contagious. It's very, very contagious. Every infected person at the lower bound infects 2 to 3 others, and that's kind of the lower bound of estimates. Number of cases doubles every 3 to 6 days whenever there's an outbreak in the area because of its high infectiousness, and this is, of course, when it's not controlled. So this is just the natural rate of expansion of COVID-19. And it has a risk of a serious illness where 10 to 20% on average get seriously ill, and half of those who get seriously ill need hospitalization. And actually, this is something that I experienced myself, not me, but my father, my dad. So he's 79, he's in New York City, and he got very seriously ill with what's very likely COVID-19. He had shortness of breath, loss of appetite, the classical symptoms of COVID-19 that are not accompanied by the flu. So he was kind of on the edge of needing hospitalization. Fortunately, my mom, she had medical training and she was able to take care of him and prevent him from going to the hospital. Eventually, he recovered. But he was kind of in that edge. He probably would have needed to go to the hospital if it wasn't for my mom. So this is a very serious thing, and I experienced it in my own life. It's much more deadly than the flu. 0.5 to 1% die of people who get COVID-19, and there's a much higher death rate for people who are over 60, so people like my dad, he lucked out, or with underlying health conditions of various sorts. And there's no effective treatment. We don't have any effective treatment despite what some experts, so-called experts, not real experts, might claim. There are no effective treatments. What political leaders may claim, there are no effective treatments for COVID-19, so be careful of that. The only actual way we'll get to a treatment is vaccine. That is the way that we'll actually address COVID-19. And unfortunately, vaccine will not be around for a very long time. It's the only effective solution. But human trials for a vaccine, you might have heard of, this vaccine going into human trials, this vaccine going into human trials. There's one that started in mid-March already in human trials, which is great. Unfortunately, human trials they have to test the safety of the vaccine and the effectiveness of the vaccine. It's estimated to take at least a year for human trials, likely closer to 18 months for human trials to go through. So as opposed to the usual 4 to 5 years. This is with all the money being thrown at it, all the regulations being cut. So you have to remember that most vaccines don't make it through human trials. Some of them are not safe, have too many side effects. Some of them are not sufficiently effective. So it's likely that the first batch of trials will not be successful. And after the vaccine is ready, the government would need to coordinate its production, distribution, actual vaccination. And the government is not as competent as we would hope it would be, as demonstrated by its responses to the early stages of the pandemic. So, possible timelines for a vaccine. There's an optimistic timeline. Wonderful. There's moderate. Expected. And there's a pessimistic. Unlikely, but, can happen. So, optimistic timeline. Approved for mass production by summer 2021. That assumes that the first batch of vaccines, one of those that's in the first wave of vaccines, is going to be successful. And in production, distribution, vaccination, the government proves to be excellently, surprisingly competent. It will take only 6 months to get at least people in the vulnerable categories vaccinated. So we might have some people at super high risk, like first responders, be vaccinated with trial vaccines, but the government, there's no way that max vaccination program will take place until any vaccine is proved safe. So that's why it will take until summer 2021, 6 months, and then most people will be vaccinated by early 2022. That's going to be the super optimistic timeline. This is very unlikely because, again, of the information I gave before. More moderate timeline. This is quite a bit more likely. Approved for mass vaccination by 2023. This assumes that there's, the first couple of waves of vaccines don't make it through human trials of safety and effectiveness, and it'll take until the third or fourth wave to make it through the trials. And then production, distribution, vaccination will take about a year, assuming the government is not wonderfully competent. And so most people will be vaccinated by 2024. That's the moderate timeline. That's the one we should expect. So that's the one I would give 70% estimate. And that covers the span of vaccine being available, vaccinated from late 2022 to late 2026. So with a midpoint of 2024. That's the one that we should prepare for if we want to have any reasonable chance of actually getting our businesses, leaders prepared for the situation. The pessimistic timeline, this is what you want to do if you want to really be prepared. It's approved for mass production by 2026. Then production, distribution, vaccination takes a year, and most people will be vaccinated by 2027. This is the remaining 25% probability. And there's definitely some indications that it might be going this direction. There was a study published literally yesterday which showed that the coronavirus vaccine the novel coronavirus has mutated into at least 30 strains. And 30 strains of the mutation shows that the mutation is going pretty quickly, much more quickly than we anticipated before. So that means it might be as problematic, not as problematic, but on the level of the flu in terms of the difficulty with getting a vaccine. And you might think this is too cynical, but we don't have an effective vaccine for the flu. Our vaccine for the flu is only 50% effective, prevents only 50% of infections. That's not great. So that would not be an effective vaccine. So hopefully COVID-19 will be something that we can provide an effective vaccine for, but it will take longer, much longer than we expect and hope. So that's what the 2027 scenario is. So that's the pessimistic one. Not fun, but it might be something that we need to prepare for. The only effective tool we have until vaccine is suppression, at least for non-authoritarian societies. We don't live in an authoritarian society. Some societies that are more authoritarian, smaller, they can do other techniques, but for us, suppression is the only option. That means a combination of shutdowns and social distancing in order to avoid overwhelming hospitals, because when hospitals get overwhelmed, all the people who would be hospitalized would die, and that's about 10 times more deaths, so an order of magnitude more deaths. It goes from 0.5 to 1% to 5 to 10%. Don't want that. So suppression, it's extremely costly, obviously hugely costly, but it's effective. We know it's effective. We know that countries that have successfully done it, the US is not there yet. We have not yet successfully done suppression. But other countries that have done suppression, they have succeeded. And this includes countries in East Asia, which were more prepared for pandemics than we were. It's countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and in Western countries as well, some developed countries, like the most comparable one to the US is Germany. Huge, very diverse country, wealthy, well-developed, much better at addressing COVID-19. So very good response. It was able to suppress it. But when government started lifting restrictions, we see the number of cases increasing. And then they had to put in more restrictions, of course, to decrease the number of cases. So that's really what we're facing. This is the reality. This is our future until vaccine. Looser restrictions, so loosening of restrictions, increasing cases. Tighter restrictions, decreasing cases. And then go around, so going through this and going back to the beginning, back to looser restrictions. This is what we're facing until, at the most optimistic, until this repeating waves, most optimistic until early 22, and that's again until the vaccination becomes available. So this is not a short-term emergency, it's a major disruption. This is something that, in the most optimistic scenario, vaccine will not be available until early 2022, early 2022, and that's a 5% scenario, less than 5% scenario, I'd say. So this is not great, and we're living in a very different world. The world has changed forever. Waves of restrictions will change a lot of things about our society, even after we get to the vaccine, most likely sometime by 2024. People's habits will be changed. With these waves of restrictions and loosenings, their values will be changed, their desires, their behaviors will never go back to the society of January 2020, and you have to be realistic about that. That's what we're facing. Now, your role is to be a trusted advisor. As a risk management professional, whether you're in the insurance part of it or just in risk management, your role is to be a trusted advisor. So you need to empower leaders whom you advise, either within the organization, if you are a risk management professional within the organization addressing insurance, or outside of the organization, if you run your own business, you are helping others and you're being a trusted advisor. And you need to empower other leaders, your organization or others with whom you interact, who are your clients, to realize the extent of this major disruption. Most are way too optimistic. You saw the statements by Elon Musk, you saw the statements by Goldman Sachs. They're still thinking in those modes. And you see there are a lot of business leaders right now who are pushing to reopen the economy, reopen the economy, reopen the economy. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know the consequences of their actions. They don't realize how dangerous and bad it would be for them to do so. And the long-term consequences of reopening the economy too early is what's happened in the US, where you'll have many more outbreaks, many more people becoming sick, and there will be much more economic costs going forward. So the consequences of reopening the economy quickly right now is much more economic pain in the future. But people don't want to hear this intuitively, immediately, until they realize all the consequences of their actions. So you need to help them prepare to face this uncomfortable reality. They don't want to intuitively hear it, and you need to help them see this. You'll help them. By doing so, you'll help them accomplish their leadership goals, of course, because, of course, if they understood the situation, they want to be long-term oriented, and they will not press for unhelpful decisions right now. And you will also build up your credibility as a trusted advisor. So both of those things will be helped if you empower leaders to realize the extent of this major disruption. Now, you don't want to plan for the optimistic scenario. Too many companies act as though the problem will blow over soon, but this is something that you can tell leaders. Hope is not a strategy. This is a famous phrase from Vince Lombardi, so this is a good way of thinking about things and framing things to the leaders for whom you serve as a trusted advisor. You want to instead prepare for a moderate or pessimistic scenario, perhaps somewhere in the middle between the moderate scenario and the pessimistic scenario. So not 2024, but 2025, 2026, maybe going in 2027, depending on your ability and your risk tolerance. You want to understand what the pandemic is. It's a slow-moving threat. And we as human beings make very bad decisions about threats. That's just the nature of these threats that are unusual, slow-moving, high-impact. We make bad decisions about them because of how our brain is wired. We're not wired to deal with these sorts of threats. Our gut reaction is to greatly underestimate such threats, both their probability and their impact. And that leads to decisions that endanger our businesses, our organizations, our careers, whatnot. This is bad. So, a little bit about me, just so you know where I'm coming from and my expertise. So my experience, my clients, media, and books. First, my experience. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts. It's a boutique consulting, coaching, and training company, and we have 20 years of helping clients in disaster avoidance, risk management, decision-making, strategic planning, all of these sorts of things. And I spent personally 15 years in academia researching all of these areas: risk management, decision-making, strategic planning, and so on. And I published in many peer-reviewed journals like Behavior and Social Issues, Journal of Social and Political Psychology, and so on. So that's kind of my credibility, combination of consulting, coaching, and training, and academic expertise in these areas. My clients include a whole bunch of companies, from innovative startups to Fortune 500 companies, ranging from Aflac to Xerox. So if you know Zappos, give me a call. Then media. I have been published in a whole bunch of media: Inc., Fast Company, Scientific American, give interviews to CBS News, Time, CNBC, NPR, Newsweek. So these are the kinds of venues where I publish regularly. And finally, I published a number of prominent best-selling books: Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, about professional decision-making, The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships, about professional and personal relationships, The Truth Seeker's Handbook, a science-based guide about how to face the uncomfortable facts of reality, what are the strategies to realize what is actually true, and how to address it. And finally, I'm very quickly writing a new book. I was invited by my publisher to write a new book very quickly about addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. So it should be available in mid-May, called Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. So that's my background, just so you understand where I'm coming from and my expertise, credibility in being able to share this information with you. So let's talk a little bit about why bad advice on COVID-19, on pandemics, on threats like this is common. It comes from dangerous judgment errors called cognitive biases. This, as I mentioned, are due to how our brain is wired, our evolutionary background, and the specific structure of our brain. Let's talk a little bit about evolutionary background. The critical thing to realize about evolutionary background is that our gut reaction, our intuition, our intuitive processes of decision-making are adapted to the savanna environment. That's what we feel comfortable with, the savanna environment. So our gut reactions, our main response to threats in the savanna environment, well, that was when we lived as hunters, foragers, and gatherers in small tribes of 15 to 150 people. So we had to have a very strong fight or flight response in that context in order to survive and thrive. We are the descendants of all of those who survived and thrived, otherwise, and procreated. By thrived, I mean procreated, spread their genes. Otherwise, if we didn't have a strong fight or flight response, we'd die. So we are the descendants of all of those people who didn't die. It was life-saving for hunters-gatherers because the risks there were intense, immediate, in the moment. Saber-toothed tiger. You might have heard of this as a saber-toothed tiger response, where we had to jump at 100 shadows in order to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. But it's really dangerous, very dangerous in today's world, because the risks we face are not the same at all. With the risks we face are long-term, they're uncertain, they're much less likely to come from a threat in the moment like a saber-toothed tiger, and much more likely to come from information that we get from a cell phone notification. So that's the kind of threats we face in the modern world. Very different threats. And there are specifically 3 dangerous judgment errors that I want to talk about here. 3 dangerous judgment errors that cause us to make really bad decisions. So these are 3 cognitive biases: the normalcy bias, planning fallacy, and hyperbolic discounting. Normalcy bias. We assume that everything will keep going according to normally, that the future will be like the past. That's the assumption. In the savanna environment, that was a pretty safe assumption. So it was pretty safe and important for us to assume that the future will be mostly like the past. A couple of things change. Maybe in the future, more people will be using smartphones, augmented reality, I don't know. But mainly the next couple of years will be much like the past. That's what we assume. And that leads us to forecast this short-term future based on short-term past. And that greatly underestimates the impact and the disruption and the likelihood of major problems like COVID-19. So it's very hard, very unintuitive for us to accept that COVID-19 has changed our world forever and we're never going back to January 2020, ever, ever, ever. That is very uncomfortable. Our gut reaction rebels at that sort of realization. And that's a major reason why a lot of business leaders, political leaders, professionals of all sorts, and of course ordinary people are making bad decisions about COVID-19. That's one. Planning fallacy. Now, we are confident about ourselves, we like our plans, so we think that everything will go according to plan. Unfortunately, things often don't go according to plan. You might have heard of the phrase, failing to plan is planning to fail. That's a bad phrase. It's a problematic phrase because it implies that when you make a plan, everything will be fine. Not a good phrase. The much better version of this phrase is failing to plan for problems is planning to fail. Again, failing to plan for problems is planning to fail. Because otherwise we underestimate threats, we underestimate risks, we underestimate the resources that we need for the future. And these resources include time, money, social capital, information, strategic planning, whatever, all sorts of resources. That's the planning fallacy. And finally, hyperbolic discounting, really important, especially in the pandemic. We greatly underestimate the importance of the long-term future. The savanna environment, that was fine, and we didn't need to think about the long-term future. All our threats, all our risks were immediate in the moment, and we couldn't really invest resources into our future. It's not like if we kill the mammoth, we can freeze the meat and save it for the future. Now, of course, we have banks, we can invest into our house, we can invest into our careers, into our organizations. But right now you can do a lot of professional development. In the savanna environment, what are you going to become a better axe chipper? Not going to help you. But right now, we can really value the long term, but we intuitively greatly underestimate the long term. And so this is a bad problem for us because we don't think about the long term impact of the pandemic going forward. So How can we overcome these dangerous judgment errors? Well, you need to go against your intuitions, and you need to help the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor go against their intuitions. Because our intuitions, of course, evolved to help early humans survive. And we're not wired for making decisions in the complex world of today. You've probably already in some ways know that. So for example, in the savanna environment, it was very important when we came across our source of sugar to eat as much of it as possible. Honey, apples, bananas, whatever. Because that's how you survive. You got the resources. Right now, unfortunately, we have way too many sources of sugar that are not healthy for us. Instead of having donuts, we should really be having fruit. That's much healthier for us. But we are triggered by donuts. So when we see a box of dozen donuts, we want to eat all of them. That's the intuitive feeling. When we have one, maybe have two, but stop at two. But it's very hard to stop at two. It's because of that intuitive savanna primitive instinct. So we need to train ourselves. Hopefully you've trained yourself. I mean, some people haven't. They still have difficulties with this. This is why we have the obesity epidemic here in the US. But hopefully many people who are listening to this webinar, checking it out, have trained themselves to address the desire, the triggering to eat coming from sugar. And this is just one of the examples. It's just as hard to address bad decision making coming from cognitive biases, this mental fitness. So that's mental fitness. It's about being mentally fit, making good decisions in your mind, as it is to address physical fitness, which is about having a good diet and doing good exercise, right? So how can you prepare? Well, you need to make a long-term change to your plans and, of course, help leaders make long-term changes to their plans. Think years, not weeks. This will be years. I can guarantee you that this will not be weeks. How can businesses prepare? There are 6 areas where businesses can prepare effectively to address COVID-19. And this is where you need to help those leaders for whom your trusted advisors prepare effectively. Fundamentally change their business model, both their internal business model and their external business model for a future based on virtual interactions, not based on face-to-face interactions. I strongly encourage you to make a commitment to virtual teams and virtual offerings, internal business model and external business model. And you want to one way of burning your bridges, which I strongly advise for my clients to do, is to consider ending your office lease. You'll free up a lot of money, honestly. A number of my clients realizing that they're freeing up a lot of money by ending their office space lease and then just switching to all virtual teams. And then if they need something for a meeting where they're socially distanced, then they just get co-working spaces. That's pretty easy to do. And it frees up a major source of funding for you, especially important in this difficult time, and for the leaders with whom you give them advice. But there are 6 areas that you want to be thinking about in your internal business model. And this is something, again, that you will help your leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor realize they need to be thinking about. Motivation, engagement, effective communication, resolving conflicts, cultivating trust, cybersecurity, and accountability. These are the areas you need to be thinking about and you need to help them think about. So first, motivation, engagement. Unfortunately, already before the pandemic, we've had a crisis of engagement in the United States. Before the pandemic, only 34% of all employees were fully engaged. Only 34% of all employees. Most of the employees, over 50%, were disengaged, meaning that they were passive, they were ready to leave their company at the first opportunity, just clocking in, and about 15% or so were actively hostile. So they were bad-mouthing the company, they were looking to leave us, they were looking for a new job. Not good. Working from home will make it even more difficult to be engaged. Now, the first few weeks of working from home, a few weeks, people are still on this emergency mode. They're still powered by adrenaline. There's this rally around the company effect, rally around the flag. You've probably heard that. And this is something that's motivating a lot of people to work hard. But this will not really last. There's going to be a lack of motivation from being around other employees. A lot of people who work in the office, they get motivated by the presence of other people around them who are working on the same things, on the same projects. And of course, this is not going to be there, and you'll have a lot more problems. You'll have kids crawling all over you, young children or their teenagers moved back into the house, and they need to take care of older adults. They are in constant space with their romantic partner, with whom they're used to being, maybe 1 hour a day, maybe 2 hours a day. Now they're with them 24/7. So it's going to be pretty stressful for them. All of these factors will make it more difficult for them to adjust. So you need to provide support and guidance to your employees, help the leaders provide support and guidance to them alert them that this is a risk, this is a serious risk, and they need to address this risk going forward. The same goes for all the other categories here. Thinking of it from a risk term, this is a serious risk for productivity, motivation, engagement. Other risks that you need to be thinking about is effective communication. So communication, already before the pandemic, effective communication was a major issue. It's pretty difficult, and virtual communication is especially difficult for those who are used to in-person communication. This written communication becomes the main form of communication because people use things like Microsoft Teams, Slack, Trello, Asana, other platforms to communicate, to collaborate, which are mainly text-based. And when you do text-based, you lose a lot of body tone and language and tonality, body language, things that you express, things that you use to effectively express what you mean. When you say something like, I think Michael should take this project, or you say, I think Michael should take this project, those are two different things. Or you say, I think Michael should take this project. Those mean very different things, but written, they would mean exactly the same thing. That's just one example where you want to help leaders realize this is a risk. So it's essential to train employees, give them effective training on how to do virtual communication effectively. So that's something that you need to be thinking about. Next, resolving conflicts. Now, in office environments, conflicts are pretty easily resolved through face-to-face interactions. You meet, when you're passing by each other in the hallway, or you pop into each other's office and you identify a problem, you nip it in the bud, or you resolve conflicts, tensions. Pretty not that difficult, although of course people have problems even in the office. Much more problematic in the environment where we are going into in virtual teams. So this is much more difficult. It's easier for problems to go unnoticed because you don't see other people, you don't see anxiety, concerns on their face and their body expression, some tensions. So it's critically important to offer training in this area. How do you notice and address problems in virtual teams? Next, cultivating trust. This is something a lot of leaders don't think about, and this is a serious risk. Teams right now in the office environment, they work based on a shared basis of trust where you chit-chat with each other, you just talk about the local sports ball team and how much you hate your rival down the road, your vacation plans, what you did this weekend, what your kids are doing, all of that sort of thing. They create a humanizing interaction where you see each other as human beings and you build up that relationship, that close relationship that provides a basis of trust. So it's easy to build up that relationship in virtual teams, but in person-to-person teams, but in virtual settings, it's much harder to do because you don't have that natural interaction. You just go and work, collaborate. So it doesn't happen naturally. There are a number of venues I can go into in the Q&A, which you can use to create, develop, cultivate trust, and that I'm helping some of my clients set up. But this is something that you need. This is not a matter of training. This is something that you need to create a deliberate venue for people to have this sort of engagement. So next, cybersecurity. Well, this seems relatively easy, but a lot of people don't think about it. I'm surprised by how many people aren't thinking of this. First of all, the FBI is already showing that many more hacking attempts are taking place right now and successes are taking place right now because criminals know that people are working in their homes, and those working in their homes are much more vulnerable to cyber attacks. Both more people are working in their homes and their homes are less safe. Their employees aren't used to following cybersecurity protocols at home, that's one. Second, their software, the hardware that they have is not hardened against cybersecurity threats. So you need to improve their cybersecurity by providing training on working at home, cybersecurity, and funding for them to improve their hardware at home to be more secure. Finally, accountability. This is something that's, again, a surprising thing. Previously, accountability is relatively easy in office teams where a leader can walk around the office and see what's going on, provide that natural way of holding an employee accountable. Same thing for a peer. You can pop into Bob's office and say, hey Bob, where's that report that we discussed you getting me yesterday? And that holds Bob accountable. It's pretty hard to ignore you when you're standing in there in the office as a peer. But of course, it's much easier to ignore an email. So new structures must be created to ensure this sort of accountability. And this is something, again, I can go into much more depth in the Q&A about how to do that. This is something I'm working with my clients on right now. So you want accountability up the chain of command, up the structured little chain of command, and you want peer-to-peer accountability as well. Both of those are important for successful internal business model. So this is something that you need to help your leaders address in order to address all the risks of internal business models switching to virtual teams in order to, of course, in the first place, address the risks of this pandemic and its long-term impact. You also want to be thinking about the external business model and how to help your leaders address the risks of the external business model transformation in the context of this pandemic. So, again, 6 areas. First, service delivery, then relationships, then managing disruptions, shifting social norms, unknown unknowns, and outcompeting your competition. First, service delivery. You want to change your services to be as much virtual as possible. If you can't, shifting to virtual, shift it to social distancing, but you want to be thinking about as much virtual as possible. And this is something that some will find easier than others. So, for example, I do a lot of speaking, training, and consulting. That's my main thing, right? So all of my speaking engagements, in-person speaking engagements, were canceled. Training engagements were canceled, and most of my consulting and engagements were canceled. So I'm shifting to virtual for all of these and developing that side of my business. So that's somewhat easier for me than it is for others, but it's still obviously a difficulty. You want to be creative, so think about how your business and help your leaders think about how their business can address these issues through virtual, through social distancing. You want to be careful about social distancing because this is an area where you can have serious liability if you go too far, too fast, you don't follow the best guidelines. There's a lot of political pressure, headwinds, crosswinds on these issues, but you want to not forget liability. The same thing, of course, applies to internal teams, which is one of the biggest reasons I recommend my clients don't go back to the office is because of liability issues. There's serious liability issues, and I don't think that Congress might go forward and protect employees from liability from coronavirus, but I'm not sure that will happen, especially, the Democrats probably don't want that to happen. So whatever, we're not going to get into politics too much, but this is the realistic, I'm not saying whether that's good or bad, I'm just saying this is likely what's going to happen based on my reading of the political situation. And you want to think about some businesses, the best choice may be to close. Restaurants are not going to do well in this situation, with chains of hair clipping, all of these personal care services are not going to do well in this situation. So if you can, you want to get out of that business. Relationships. You want to think about managing your relationships effectively. You want to both establish new relationships and cultivate existing relationships using virtual formats. This is not easy. This is something that you want to be thinking about with external stakeholders of all sorts. Clients, how do you cultivate existing relationships and establish new ones in virtual teams, in virtual settings? This is difficult to do. People are used to having that handshake, that pat on the shoulder, and you're not going to be able to do that. So you need to learn how to do that, how to do virtual cultivation of relationships. For your service providers, existing service providers, for political leaders with whom you might be engaging, local government officials, right now they're especially important in determining the health of businesses. So you want to be thinking about how to engage with them virtually effectively. Prospects, of course, potential new clients, that's the new relationships, investors, existing investors, suppliers of various sorts. You want to invest in professional development to enable yourself to develop virtual relationships, effective relationships virtually with external stakeholders. So think about that. Then manage disruptions. Now, a lot of your service providers, a lot of your investors will not be nearly as savvy as you are and will not be thinking about the long term. They'll be thinking it's going to be a few weeks, maybe a couple of months to blow over. This is bad thinking. This is wrong, but they will be thinking this. And some of them you'll be able to convince otherwise, and you should try, of course. But some of them you won't. So you need to prepare yourself for them making these serious mistakes and protect yourself. Get other potential service providers, think about other investors, ways that you can protect yourself against failures by external stakeholders. Next, unknown unknowns. Now, shifting norms. So first, shifting norms. You want to be thinking about how after several years of restrictions and loosenings, the norms will be shifted. So I mentioned a lot of that. People have different wants, norms, desires, expectations, habits, and you want to get ahead of that. You want to get ahead of that curve. Think about how it applies to your business, how it applies to your area, and get ahead of that curve. Help the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor get ahead of that curve by 2024. What changes will take place? So anticipate, get ahead of these shifts. That's the goal. Then, unknown unknowns. So this is a really important area. The pandemic was a predictable disaster. It wasn't a black swan. A lot of people are calling it a black swan, completely unpredictable, whatever. No, not true. So many people are predicting that a new pandemic would take place. It's more like a gray rhino. So that's the term for predictable disasters, major disasters. So you want to change, you can actually predict things. There are some things that you think might be unpredictable, but they actually are predictable. And you can scan your environment for potential major disasters. And there's a number that are specifically associated with COVID-19 that people really are not thinking about right now. Very seriously not thinking about right now. I'm writing that chapter in my book right now, actually, about the issues that people aren't thinking about right now that are specifically due to COVID-19. And a whole bunch of other ones that are not directly related to COVID-19, but are impacted by it. And you want to protect yourself against these unknown unknowns, against these problems. Now, not everything can be predicted, of course. Some things are true unknown unknowns. You can't predict them. And that's where you can maintain a cash cushion for protection. We can talk about that later in the Q&A. Then help the leaders outcompete their competition. Help those for whom you're a trusted advisor, or if you're a leader of a company yourself, of course, consultant or something like that, outcompete your competition. Now, realize that a lot of your competition will not be nearly as savvy as you. They will not be watching this webinar. They will not be thinking about the long term. They'll be thinking it's going to blow over in a few weeks. The steps I shared, if you take them, implement them right now, help the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor, implement them, they will get you ahead of the game. They will help you get a major competitive advantage. And when many other people will fail to prepare for a pandemic, they will be hobbled, they will be hurt. And this is your opportunity to get ahead of these stumbling competitors. So you want to seize market share and hire away good employees. So think about that, prepare for that to happen in the span of the next year. 6 to 12 months, that's when you should be prepared to outcompete your competition. So be prepared for that, start getting ready for it right now. There are a number of steps you can take for it, we can talk about that. Then, your plan. So we talked about preparing a long-term plan. Here are the 6 steps that you want to be thinking about for preparing an excellent long-term plan to address the pandemic. Think about possible futures that might occur. Think about that 5 years out, what will happen. Think about potential problems and how you can address them, the opportunities and how you can seize them, the resources that you'll need, and the information showing you which future you're actually heading toward. So, futures. Plan for a variety of possible futures. I mentioned only 3 here, and we'll talk about them. So invest your resources according to the futures. The optimistic future, that's widely available vaccine by 2022, very unlikely. Moderate future, by 2024, much more likely. And pessimistic future, hopefully not, but also, I'd give it a 25% probability that it won't be until 2027. So again, optimistic, 5%, moderate, that span between late 2022 and late 2026 would be 70%, and then 2027 onward would be 25%. Midpoint for the moderate scenario is 2024. I recommend that you prepare for 2025, 2026. Next, so that's the possible futures. Think about what's going to happen 5 years out. That's the thing that you want to be thinking about. Imagine what the business would look like, what your business would look like, what your leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor would look like. What would it look like in 5 years in each of these scenarios? The optimistic, the moderate, the pessimistic one. So think about that, make a plan. Then identify the problems that would take place in each scenario. List them for each of the potential scenarios, all the problems, and think of ways to address them in advance. How can you solve these problems in advance, right now? And take the steps that you can identify to address these problems in advance, or make a plan to address them if they come up, so that when they do happen, you know exactly what to do. The same thing for opportunities. Think about all the opportunities that might take place. I talked about your competitors, and there are many other opportunities that might take place. List them for each scenario, of course. Think of ways to bring about these opportunities right now to the extent that you can by investing some resources into the needed areas, or make a plan to seize them if they do occur. Then, resources. Think about resources of all sorts to address problems and seize opportunities in each of these scenarios. Money, capital, time, information, strategic planning resources, and so on. And make a plan to reserve them for each of the scenarios, especially the pessimistic scenarios. So that's what you want to be heading toward, that 2025, 2026. If you really can't, go for 2024, but I recommend 2025, 26. ideally 2027. That's what you want to be preparing for. Don't plan for the early 2022 of the optimistic scenario. Very unlikely. And then think about what information would indicate to you that you're going toward each of these futures. Look at the research look at the most updated information on what's going on with COVID-19. Are the vaccines indeed failing, or are they surprisingly successful? What are the treatments like? Don't listen to newspaper hype. Listen to people who are actually looking and examining what's going on, the CDC, Bill Gates, WHO, whichever kind of authoritative figures who have predicted the situation. Bill Gates, I think, is a good one for this. He actually came out with a good statement just yesterday on what are the next steps, how will we come out of this scenario, the pandemic. And he kind of thinks it's aligned with what I'm talking about. Monitor the information closely and adjust your plans accordingly. So if you see that we're surprisingly lucky, adjust your plans toward the optimistic scenario. If you're seeing that some of the early vaccines are failing, definitely adjust for the moderate scenario. If there's strong evidence that the vaccines, all of them, are not going to be quite nearly as successful as people hope, then go for the pessimistic one. And then just execute. Help the leaders execute effectively. So that's the plans, and that's what you should be thinking about for the long term. So additional resources. There are some additional resources that you can check out on these topics at tinyurl.com/d/event. tinyurl.com/d/event. My RIMS courses. So I'm offering a number of courses through RIMS in collaboration with RIMS. One of them is called Managing Blind Spots and Biases. So general principles of managing blind spots and biases. We'll talk about COVID-19 some, of course, but we'll talk about the broader principles going much more depth. That's a 2-day course. Each of them is a 2-day course. And they are available in online format. So online courses, asynchronous 2-day course, or in-person format if your local RIMS group would like to host it, or your company would like to host it, something like that. Then how to make the best decisions. That's kind of building up on the blind spots and in using our knowledge of blind spots and biases. I only talked about 3 cognitive biases in this presentation. There are over 100. And my book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, talks about the 30 most dangerous for businesses and how to address them. Then building up on top of that, how do you make the best decisions as informed by our knowledge of the biases? And finally, again, online course as well as in-person course, whatever fits your needs, 2-day course. Finally, business resiliency. How do you make an effective long-term plan going forward in such a way as to address the cognitive biases and make the best decisions in the long-term future? Again, 2-day course, online and in person, whatever fits your needs. Then, I'm a member of the about 10 people RIMS Ask a Peer for consulting and coaching. So if you contact RIMS for Ask a Peer, go to tinyurl.com/david-event. I'll send you more information about that. So consulting or coaching, first hour free, so check that out. Then 2 chapters from my forthcoming book. This is going to be free. All of those other ones are paid, of course. This is going to be a free for you. So 2 chapters from my forthcoming book on adapt and plan resilience, adapt and plan for the new abnormal of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. And that's, again, available at tinyurl.com. So check that out. And I hope that you've enjoyed this webinar. And now is the time for Q&A. So please let me know what questions you might have about this.
Excellent. It looks like we have a few questions to start off with. How do you incorporate new data from serological tests regarding a higher population of those with antibodies than reported cases would suggest?
Right, the Santa Clara study, that has been shown to be very problematic. So first of all, it showed death rates of 0.12 to 2.5, I think. And if you follow those death rates, considering the number of people in New York City who died, then you would have actually more people infected in New York City than live in New York City, considering the number of deaths in New York City. So it's ludicrous. The study has a number of failures. It's, for example, it recruited people through Facebook and just said, hey, if you want to get testing on antibodies, come to the center. And that's going to, of course, that's not going to get you a random sample. That's a cognitive bias called selection bias, where people who have had symptoms of COVID-19 will want to know, did I have COVID-19 or did I not? So of course they'll go to get tested. And people who didn't have symptoms of COVID-19, they will be much less likely to go and do the pretty dangerous task of getting in their cars, going to the testing center and getting tested. There are a number of other errors in that study, so do not trust that study. It's not been peer reviewed. It's hyped in a number of venues that like to hype these sorts of things because they like the conclusions of COVID-19 not being that fatal. But don't trust that study. Sorry. Next one.
Thank you. Will the audience have access to this recording presentation?
That's right. The audience will have access to this recording presentation. Yep. RIMS will make it available, and for people especially who fill out the tinyurl.com/de-event, I can just send it to you pretty easily.
It'll be available on Risk Knowledge and Opus Ed.
Perfect. Thank you. Appreciate it, Justin.
Much. Perfect. Next question is, how can these strategies be applied in manufacturing environments?
Well, a number of my clients are in manufacturing. So what you want to do in manufacturing environments is send your office workers to work from home. So that's definitely internal. And then you work in shifts. So what you want to do is work socially distanced in shifts for manufacturing. And that's something that you want to be thinking about. In the longer term, what you can do is move as much to robotics as possible. Right now, the costs have not justified some people moving as much to robotics as they ideally can. But given that it's going to be pretty costly for you to keep teams working in the office, in the manufacturing space at socially distanced with all the infection cleaning and of course legal liability, you want to invest more into robotics going forward. So right now, working in shifts, longer term, investing into robotics, that's kind of and of course sending your team from the office to working at home. That's stuff that I would talk about in terms of combination of internal work, how you can do this, and all the stuff from internal teams applies, of course, so on your office workers. For external service delivery, there's a lot of the stuff applies anyway. You want to be able to do virtual distanced collaboration with vendors, investors, clients, prospects, and so on. So this is how I'm working with my clients who are manufacturing clients to address this issue. And I think you can do the same thing with your clients and your leaders who you're working with.
Excellent, thank you. Next question is, if your business is engaged hospitality, say restaurants and hotels, these are not virtual businesses.
Yes.
Is there any advice? So we are out of business and jobs.
Yeah, this is hard. I've just helped one of my clients who was the COO of a 24 chain restaurant diner chain in the Midwest transition and to being in the grocery store business. Became the regional manager of a series of grocery stores. She got out of that business. This is not a good business to be in. This is a business that's going to be the loser. And I think that this is, if you can, to the extent that you can, transitioning out of that business is going to be the best advice I can give you, because it's going to be really, really bad, much worse than people who are optimistic and hopeful in those businesses are anticipating.
Thank you. Our next question is, please expand on what you mean by continuing liability issues and why these would be problematic in a return to office scenarios.
Of course. So if somebody comes into the office and gets sick with COVID-19, and then their lawyer comes and then dies or gets seriously sick or something like that, but let's assume dies, obviously that's the bad scenario, and then their family comes after you and says, because of the inadequate social distancing standards in the office, you have caused this person to die and you are negligently liable for it. That's the one obvious scenario. Then the same thing that's with the internal team. Same thing can happen with customers, clients who come to your office and who would say something, if you didn't have an adequate safety guidelines, not everyone was wearing a mask, not everyone was following all the CDC guidelines. And if you actually look at the CDC guidelines, they're really hard to follow, really strict, really hard to follow. So there will be a lot of ways that lawyers who will be looking for business after losing a lot of business will be able to make people liable. This is a very serious legal risk. So this is one of the big reasons I'm strongly advising my clients and as many people as possible to get out of the office and stay out. Don't yo-yo back and forth when there's loosening of restrictions, going back to the office and then coming back. First of all, creates instability. This is a big problem, and you want to create stability and routines for people. That's how things will work effectively, but also liabilities are going to be a serious issue when somebody dies and then their family comes after you.
Thank you. So the next question, are the slides alone going to be available after the presentation?
No, the slides are coming from Prezi. So Prezi is not a typical it's not kind of a typical PowerPoint slide. So those slides, I can't make them available, unfortunately. If you do have Prezi and just fill out the tinyurl.com/de-event, I'll be happy to share the Prezi presentation with you as well. So just let me know.
Excellent, thank you. Next question is, if we suppress flatten the curve now, this doesn't seem sustainable. How will the economy really survive if customers would not access most retail companies?
So what has been shown successful in other countries that have done suppression is that when they did early suppression, then they had a much smaller outbreak. So then they can do contact tracing and isolation much more effectively. And that is where you figure out who is sick after you have loosenings of restrictions, and then you contact all the people who they interacted with and get them to self-quarantine. So that's what a successful initial suppression strategy has led to, because then there's loosening, then there's contact tracing, isolation, and only in small areas, small regions have there been outbreaks. So for example, you might be reading about Singapore, and then they have the only areas where they are having serious outbreaks is in workers' barracks for migrant workers. But the rest of Singapore, I mean, it's bad, but it's not nearly as bad as having all of Singapore having outbreaks as is happening in New York City, right? So a successful suppression strategy would look like having initial suppression to such an extent that you can suppress cases, that no new cases are appearing, and then as you open up restrictions, you can do isolation and contact tracing. So as new cases appear, you can isolate the person with a case of COVID-19 as a result of extensive testing, and then trace their contacts and isolate them but get them to self-quarantine. And then if in small region, let's say there's an outbreak in a certain city, then you can have just that city, as opposed to the whole state, have a stay-at-home order for a certain period of time. So that's ideally how a regime of isolation, shutdowns would happen in a way that doesn't break the economy. And that's the ideal scenario. Now, I'm not confident about the competence of many politicians in the US being able to bring about this scenario. So, there's a lot of people piling on the Georgia Governor Kemp for opening up barbershops, and I'm going to pile up on him as well. This is a very, very dumb move, very not helpful. It's going to result, again, criticized widely by Republicans and Democrats alike, because it's going to result in many more infections that you can't trace, spike in cases, and then Georgia will have to close for a much longer time because there will be many more COVID-19 cases than there should have been otherwise. So that's what you shouldn't be doing. You should be doing the contact tracing isolation after bringing cases down.
Excellent. Next question. This is incredibly informative and eye-opening. When this becomes available for viewing after the live presentation is complete, is this something I can share with my colleagues who are not members of RIMS, or is this only for eyes of RIMS members?
Justin?
You can send that question privately. We'll work with you on an answer for that.
Okay, great. And if you fill out the tinyurl.com/de-event, we can talk about that as well. So just keep that in mind, and I'll talk to Justin about this to make sure that we have a clear answer. Thank you for asking that.
Excellent. Next question is, I am wondering about examples of unknown unknowns.
Glad you asked. So for example, right now, in Africa, in specifically the Horn of Africa, East Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, there's, I don't know if you heard about this, but there's a plague of locusts. Yes, it's a biblical issue. So there's an increasingly large plague of locusts growing there. And ordinarily, when the locusts are happening, so these are these are types of grasshoppers that swarm and eat a lot of the crops. Ordinarily, when that happens, then farmers, well, external agents from from a number of organizations, World Bank and so on, are able to come in and provide support and help for them to suppress them with with pesticide of various sorts, as well as some local experts who are already in the countries are able to come out with pesticide and address that. Now, due to travel restrictions associated with COVID-19, and that's one, there's much less ability to do so. All the borders are closed, right? You can't have external people coming in, and internal people, they're restricted from traveling. So people from the cities who are the experts who know how to control these outbreaks, they're not able to come to the farms to control the outbreak. And the Western governments, which would ordinarily provide expertise, aid, and so on, they are really busy with controlling COVID-19 at home, so they don't have extra money and extra resources to send people into that area. And what will happen then? Well, what will happen is that these swarms will grow larger, and they will expand out from Ethiopia, Somalia, and so on, and go over the whole of Africa. And this is a very serious problem. It will cause biblical famines. The biblical issue, biblical plague, will cause biblical famines, all because of COVID-19. So this is a combination, an unexpected event that grows and becomes a major disaster because of the indirect consequences of COVID-19. So this is just an example. So if your supply chains are dependent on Africa, you want to be careful and thinking about the kind of civil unrest, food riots that will happen there. You already have a lot of economic downturn in Africa because of COVID-19, and when you don't have food for people because all the crops have been eaten, that's the main subsistence crops in Africa that will have been eaten by locusts. That will be pretty terrible. So it'll be a humanitarian disaster, and for those businesses that are dependent on Africa for their supply chains, an economic disaster. So that's an example of something that's definitely going to be happening, and that's going to be a very serious issue 6 months from now, 6 to 12 months from now, when the crops that should have been ripened and harvested will not be there.
Excellent. Next question is, have you offered your services to the White House?
Thank you. I appreciate that. I work with businesses. I really don't like getting into politics because that's sort of a dangerous field. When my book is published, I'll be happy to send them a free copy. Let's say it that way.
Thank you. Next question is, what do you think will be the future of people like us, those who are in offering of risk management services and insurance to B2B clients? I am planning to expand my insurance marketing business aggressively. Is it a good time?
This is a good time to think about your insurance to become a thought leader, and becoming a thought leader on the kind of ways that people want to be thinking about the pandemic in the long run. This is everything that people are thinking about. So the way that you can tie, first of all, your insurance marketing to the pandemic is going to be important, but you want to become a credible thought leader. So producing content about the pandemic and how your insurance can help address the pandemic would be really helpful, because people are really thinking about, they're trying to cut costs right now, and they're thinking that the pandemic will be a short-term thing. If you can demonstrate that, hey, already right now you're clearly demonstrating that the pandemic is going to be a long-term thing, and you're creating thought leadership content around that, and you're having insurance offerings around addressing the long-term impact of the pandemic, that's something that's going to cause people to wake up and take notice in a couple of months as they realize the pandemic will not fade in the summer. So many people are still thinking that kind of a pretty absurd idea. We have a number of studies that show a number of actually areas that are hot right now, where the pandemic where COVID-19 is expanding pretty quickly. Not as quickly as in climates that are colder, but still quickly enough. So the pandemic will not disappear by the summer, and if you can show that by the summer you have developed some thought content, leadership content, marketing content that's going to be really relevant to this, I think that will help expand the insurance business quite effectively.
The next question, is it possible that COVID-19 was around prior to December? We were in Europe at the end of December, or at the end of October, beginning of November, and my husband was very sick. He's never been so sick, and he ended up with breathing issues, pneumonia. Is it possible it was around prior?
Of course. So we know that in certain areas of Europe, especially Italy, northern Italy, the area that was hardest hit by the pandemic, has a very strong connection to Wuhan, the city in China that was strongest hit by the pandemic. By the way, this is a huge city. It's 11 million people. It's the internal industrial hub of China. It's been called the Chicago of China, and it's a very big city. So people have not been paying nearly enough attention to how important and big of a city it is in China, and that it was all shut down. So that's one issue. But people from Wuhan have been traveling to northern Italy extensively for a long time, and we don't know how long it has been around in Wuhan. It's probably since November at least. So in Wuhan has 500 flights per day, international flights per day, and if you assume something like 250 people per flight on average, that's 10,000 people a day going out of Wuhan. So yes, so some of them might well have been infected and have brought it to Europe and so on, especially if you've been around northern Italy, but elsewhere in Europe as well, where people from Wuhan might have traveled. Yes, definitely could have been the case.
Excellent. Our next question, is there any advice for nursing homes?
So for nursing homes, what you want to be thinking about is social distancing. Of course, this is a huge thing. Following all the CDC guidelines. If you're not able to follow all the CDC guidelines, which a number of nursing homes honestly are not because of the strictness of the guidelines, I'd strongly recommend seeing if some of the families can take their patients home, because you don't want to be known as the nursing home that had an outbreak and had various issues happen there. So this is something that you want to be thinking about. If you're not able, communicating honestly with the families of the patients, telling them that, hey, it feels uncomfortable. It feels kind of uncomfortable to reveal this information, but telling them that, hey, we're not able to get the PPE that's needed for us to be really safe. We're not able to have the social distancing. So if you don't want grandma in this sort of environment, I recommend that you temporarily take her home, and we'll of course give you a refund for taking grandma home until we're able to ensure the safety of everyone. And this is a serious issue that I strongly recommend that nursing homes take that step in order to be prepared and in order to avoid legal liability, which I can guarantee to you is coming down the road for a lot of nursing homes that have not taken these sorts of steps.
Excellent. Our next question, how do you see this impacting the transport industry, for example, aviation and airports?
Badly. So the airplanes will be much more hit than they think they will, because again, a lot of people are hoping that it will be around only for the next few months, but it will not be. So airplane, and the government will not be, it gave that one-time 50 billion grant/loan to airplanes, to the airplane industry. I don't think any more money is forthcoming from the government for the airplane industry in particular. So maybe potentially it can take advantage of other loans, but there's serious issues in the airplane industry. They will have many less clients, many less people flying. What I'm suspecting will happen is going to be some mergers where the weaker ones will be swallowed up by the larger ones, by the stronger ones, and those might get some kind of government support. But this is something that's not going to be an industry that's going to take it well. This is one of those industries, just like the train industry, bus industry. People will not want to be traveling right now. A lot of people who previously have been traveling by airplanes, when they need to travel, they'll prefer to take a day-long car trip where they can stay socially isolated rather than risk going on an airplane. A lot of people are scared, a lot of people are worried, and that's going to impact the airplane industry I'm honestly past the vaccines, because some people will not believe that vaccines are effective, and some people will not want to get vaccines because of anti-vaxxer sentiments. And so you will need to plan for 2025, 2026 in order to provide a cushion of safety for the airplane industry for when vaccines will be out. And before that, lots of people will not be taking airplanes.
Next question. What are some downstream dependencies for the pandemic that we should be mindful of that could be catastrophic to government organizations?
The last one, test drives for government organizations. Can you please repeat that, Kay?
Yes, of course. I'll repeat the entire question.
Yes.
What are some downstream dependencies for the pandemic that we should be mindful of that could be catastrophic to government organizations?
Catastrophic. Well, one of the things is just the politics of the issue. Right now, you'll see a lot of, and I'm not commenting on whether it's good or bad, but you'll see that a lot of Republicans, specifically in the Senate. So this is a situation. I'm not saying whether it's good or bad. I'm not taking a political side, but I'm just analyzing the situation. This is something that I do. So looking at the situation right now, it seems that both Trump and the Democrats, the president and the Democrats in Congress, want to give funding to states and cities and municipalities and so on. The Republicans, at least in the Senate, seem to be strongly opposed. So this might be a dynamic that, depending on how things shake out, that money will not be forthcoming to municipalities, to states, and so on. And that will be, of course, catastrophic because so much of the state and city budget has been devastated by the pandemic. And as a result, there will be a lot of need for budget cuts, which might well happen. And so this is something a lot of states, a lot of cities are not taking this nearly as seriously as they are also following the advice of Goldman Sachs and other, Elon Musk and so on, many others who are thinking that, hey, it'll be over by in a couple of months. They don't realize the long-term impact of this, and they're not planning for that long-term impact. They think that there will be a V-shaped recovery. There won't be. The recovery will be at best U-shaped, and it will take a while until the vaccine is available. We will not have any serious recovery until vaccine is available. And so you want to be thinking about 2024, 2025 with serious depressed level of economic activity, with loosening and tightening of restrictions. Of course, medical establishments, to the extent that they're dependent on local municipalities, will require more money. So those are some things that you want to be thinking about. Ideally, you want to send your workers to work from home as much as possible. So having virtual work as much as possible, that's something you want to be thinking about. I strongly want to encourage you to think about cybersecurity. A number of municipalities have been hacked very badly and had cybersecurity breaches. There will be many more of these going forward because people who are working from home in different environments, they're not used to thinking about cybersecurity as they are in the office. So that's something you want to be investing into professional development for that. Other areas are the things that I mentioned earlier, the external business model and the internal business model. Thinking about how you can deliver municipal services virtually will be very helpful. City services virtually will be very helpful to the extent that you can. And then think about the kind of needs that people will have. I mean, it's really heartbreaking for me to see people on the streets, poor people who are not able to get the homeless shelter services that they previously needed. It's also heartbreaking for me to look at the future, 6 months ahead, and see all the healthcare workers, police, firefighters, and so on, first responders, whose jobs will be eliminated because the city-state budgets will be cut, and they can't not be cut unless the federal government steps up. And again, there's high probability that it won't. So there's a lot of these sorts of concerns that you want to be thinking about. And you can email me prior. So again, if you fill out the form, I'll send you the resources, and then we can have an exchange about any of these questions, and that one in particular, and as well as, of course, any others I can talk about in much more depth. Please go ahead.
The next question is, I work for a school division. We take our direction from the health departments. How do you see classroom learning for K through 12 schools moving forward from a moderate view?
From moderate view, I'd say that right now, what will likely happen will be a number of classes will do hybrid, where schools will do hybrid, where there will be shifts of students, maybe some in the morning, some in the evening, to allow for social distancing. That it's not the best strategy. And of course, some more online learning. Ideally, to the extent that you have control to influence on this, is to be able to move to all virtual learning with some in-class activities like lab that can't be done virtually. Although there have been a number of good lab virtual developments, so where you can do labs virtually, and maybe some in-school events that need to really be done that are going to be difficult to do otherwise. But ideally, to the extent that you have control, to move it as much of it virtual as possible. And it's not as good. I mean, I know that, I'm an educator, but this is something, I was in the higher academia for 15 years, including 7 years as a professor at Ohio State, and before that I taught as a fellow. So I know that education in that context is not nearly as good when it's not face-to-face, but you can't afford to rely on face-to-face education in this context until there is a vaccine. So thinking in that moderate scenario, that 5-year span, think about that plan and how you would handle education, ideally moving as much of it virtual as possible, and whatever you can't move virtual, having it social distancing at 10 feet ideally. The 6 feet is a super minimal number. The research, when you look at the research, they say 6 feet minimal, 10 feet ideal. So you want to do 10 feet to the extent that you can, extensive sanitation, of course, and all of that.
Dr. Gleb, can you take one last question?
Happy to.
Okay, Kai. So,
of course. So the next question, have you seen studies regarding the long-term impact of isolation or work at home on the health of people outside of the COVID exposures? If the economy collapses, how many people will be harmed by this?
So two things, so two parts of the question. The long-term effects of working at home, there's going to be more isolation, so more mental health struggles. That's going to be one thing. It's not working from home, but the thing that you want to be thinking about separately is lack of access to gyms, outdoor exercises. You'll have physical fitness struggles. So those are things that you can replace. And those are things I strongly, when I talk, I do some executive coaching and I talk to executives, I talk to them about their personal life as well. I strongly encourage them to look for ways to replace the previous ways that they interacted with others socially with online experience. So that doesn't mean only Zoom parties. Something that I'm personally doing and that I'm encouraging people to do is doing online games, apps. I'm playing Scrabble with colleagues and friends with whom I used to interact and play tennis together. And then I'm doing exercise at home for physical fitness. And so you want to be able to replace, and these are just some examples, so you want to be able to replace with virtual connections things that you previously used to do face-to-face. So those are the kinds of things you want to be thinking about. Mental health is going to be seriously impacted. Physical health is going to be impacted, and you want to think about right now how, for that moderate scenario, for the 5 years, you are going to take care of your mental health and your physical health, and you're going to help others for whom you're a trusted advisor, and just your family members and friends. Take care of their mental health and their physical health. Take care of the older people in your life who are over 60, so not old people, but older people, because they are especially vulnerable due to COVID-19, so caretaking for them. So that's kind of one example, one side of it. And the other side of it is the economic. It's going to be pretty terrible. So the best bet we have right now in order to avoid an economic collapse is to have suppression right now, and then contact tracing and isolation going forward with regional suppressions if there's a serious outbreak in an area. That wave of loosening restrictions that I talked about. That's the best thing we can do, because if you have outbreaks in more areas, if you have more people traveling to more areas, and you have more COVID-19 spreading, then you'll have more trouble getting control of it going forward, and you'll have much more devastating economic impacts rolling onward. So we can't fall into hyperbolic discounting. We can't let tomorrow's we can't let losing $1 tomorrow cost us losing $10 a week from now, cost us losing $100 a month from now, costing us losing $1,000 a year from now. All of those are orders of magnitude difference, and we need to understand that by losing a smaller amount right now, we are gaining much more going forward. We're protecting ourselves from that loss. So we can't fall into hyperbolic discounting. And what we need to do as a society is to up the amount of testing so that we can do so that we can do testing, isolation of cases after they've been brought down in certain areas, and then contact tracing of these people. And so with that dynamic, we can minimize the economic costs. Because if we just open up the economy right now, I can guarantee to you the economic costs will be much more devastating down the road, because people will not accept New York-like situations, levels of hospital overload, and we will have to close our cities, we'll have to close our states at a much higher extent and longer if we don't do shorter closing down right now for the then contact tracing and isolation.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Saporsky. I'd like to thank you again for your time and expertise. A copy of this webinar will be archived on Opus Ed and Risk Knowledge within a few days, probably Monday of next week. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe. Be sure to check out tinyurl.com/DAE-event for more information. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.